Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome. I do these weekly um, video broadcasts with SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery in mind, but also take into account a lot of non-technical aspects. And one of the reasons I kind of want to focus on that is because when I work with the customers on deploying or even managing an always on availability solution, it is natural for tech professionals, whether they're a sysadmin who are now given the responsibility to manage an always on availability or a DBA, they're so focused on the tech that sometimes they, I don't want to say ignore, but they kind of sidestep a lot of the non-technical aspects that make or break a deployment. Today's topic is kind of like a combination of what is going on around us, plus some of the challenges that most SQL Server DBAs face. And I've seen this a lot with my customers where there are a couple of reasons why people would bring me on board. For one, they need to deploy an always on available solution. They don't have anybody on their team who knows about this technology. Maybe their line of business applications require this. Maybe the vendor suggested that they deploy an availability group, or excuse me, their CIO watched a webinar and the speaker either is from Microsoft or somebody in the community who's talking about always on availability group, and now they want that as part of their solution. In some cases, though, I get brought in because, excuse me, they already have it, they already have an existing infrastructure, but then it's causing a lot of problems. And it is challenging to manage something like that if you don't have the skill set in place. And it's interesting. The reason I mentioned that this is somehow relevant to what is going on. You probably heard about the Great Resignation. People are leaving their jobs, especially after the whole pandemic thing, where people left, not left. Some of them were forcefully furloughed, terminated forcefully because of all the events that happened. And it is now challenging to bring in the talent. Now, as somebody who, let's say you've been a DBA before, and after this, pandemic, you lost your job and you're now back in the job market. If you noticed, a ton of the job postings out there would have as part of their requirement well versed in SQL Server high availability solution. In fact, sometimes they butcher the name. SQL Server always on high availability. And you kind of wonder, how can I apply for these jobs, for these opportunities, if I don't even have the experience to work with, or I've never touched an always on availability before? It's interesting because when you start reading the job descriptions, you start to see some unrealistic job requirements. Somebody with 10 years of experience or 20 years of experience. I remember somebody posted on one of the SRE posts, 10 years experience with Kubernetes, for instance, or 10 years experience with SQL Server on Linux. SQL Server on Linux was not introduced until SQL Server 2017, and that's not even 5 years ago from the date of release. But the thing is, because you want to land that job, because you want to get that opportunity, sometimes people are put off because they don't have the experience required by the job description. And some people would say that's a unicorn requirement. They're probably just giving you everything that they want, not realizing that this is the very reason why people don't want to apply for these jobs. You don't feel confident applying for these job opportunities. That's one. Another thing is that sometimes you don't feel qualified to even work with technology within your team. I remember I struggled so much with performance tuning when I was starting out. And anytime a ticket would come in, anytime a service request would come in that had something to do with performance tuning, either indexing or troubleshooting, excuse me, troubleshooting an issue with slow running queries, I avoid it at all costs. So I would always think of ways on how to pass the ticket to one of my colleagues because I'm not confident to even work on it. And the challenge with that is I have been disqualifying myself from taking on responsibilities that I can do given that I have had the right experience. And that's why this topic, if I could put the banner on real quick, succeeding as a SQL Server DBA, even without production experience. And the challenge, again, that most people think is that they're not qualified to work with, in this case, always on availability groups because they don't have the right production experience, or they've never touched it before, or uh, they probably worked on it a couple of times, but that's it. Okay. Um, I want to share with you some of my personal experience working both with my clients in the past, as well as my own personal experience where starting out as a SQL Server DBA has been a challenge for most people because they think I need production experience where I can have hands-on working experience with a technology in order for me to succeed. And if, let's say, for instance, that maybe you're just starting out, you're a junior DBA, or maybe you're still doing help desk, but you disqualifying yourself, as I mentioned in the beginning, you're disqualifying yourself from the opportunities because you don't have the right experience. I'm going to share with you three things that have helped me personally when I was starting out, as well as how I help my customers manage their existing always on availability groups, despite the fact that they don't have any experience, they've never worked on it before, to a point where now they're not just deploying availability groups, but they're also building their own teams managing this. And this is critical because this is not just specific to always on available groups. As far as technology is concerned, every technology out there is the same. I just want to focus on always on available groups because that's kind of like my key area of expertise. If you have your pen and paper ready, write this down. So if you want to succeed as a SQL Server DBA or as a technology professional, even without the experience, the first thing, and this is very, very important, a lot of people just brush this aside thinking, I don't really need that. The first thing that you need to prepare for, and I say prepare for because this is not something that is easily achievable. That's why I needed to put it first as a priority. First is to promote yourself. And I know what you're thinking. How do I promote myself? I'm just DBA. How do I even do that? Promote yourself. Give yourself a new title. That, for most people, is very difficult to do. I forgot who said it, but I read a quote at one point: the most powerful force in a human being is to be um, in alignment with who you believe you are. And this is interesting because it's interesting to see how most of the people that I work with are expecting to learn something, expecting to be really, really good at something, yet they do not see themselves as that. I'll give you a very simple example. As, let's say, a junior DBA who's simply doing daily operational stuff like checking the SQL Server agent jobs, checking the backups. If you want to work with a complex architecture like always on availability groups, you can't think like a help desk person. You cannot think like an operational person. You have to elevate yourself to start thinking like an architect, an infrastructure architect. Why? Because that's what it takes for you to start building an always on availability groups. And again, I'll go back to the example that I mentioned earlier, applying for a new job opportunity. how do you expect yourself to accomplish a complex task like building an always on availability or even troubleshooting an outage? How do you expect to achieve those goals or perform those tasks if you're seeing yourself as somebody who's simply going through the tickets and responding to user requests to reset their password or helping the developers? You have to give yourself a new title. And this is very challenging because it's easy for us to see what is right in front of us. It is very easy for us to say, hey, I'm just an operational DBA, or I'm just a help desk person, or I'm just a sysadmin. Even putting the word just, I am just, is preventing you from trying to achieve that goal, which is to work with always on availabilities. And I use this example because this will help you with the next three things. The next two things, by the way, I'm going to share with you three things. By promoting yourself, giving yourself a new title, will allow you to prepare for the next two things that I'm going to share. And it also opens up your opportunity, it opens up your way of thinking to a totally different opportunity. When I first, before I started doing consulting, I was an operational DBA. And prior to that, I was a data center engineer. And I transitioned quickly from a data center engineer to a consultant in my very first formal production job, mainly because the people that I've been working with saw that I was doing consulting work. My official title was a data center engineer, but I never saw myself as a data center engineer. I saw myself as a consultant. Hence, I carried myself as a consultant. When I get brought in to troubleshoot an issue, maybe SQL Server was down or a cluster is not responding, I did not see myself just as an engineer. I saw myself as a consultant looking at different teams, looking at how the application is working. And that allowed me to transition easily to be a consultant because a lot of people already saw that I was already doing the work of a consultant. And in the same way, it helped me think about how would a consultant think? How would a consultant behave? Or how would they respond to this? And I'm spending a lot of time on this because this is inner work. Nobody can teach you this, and this is inner work. The problem most of the time is that you're always being told you got to be modest, you don't be so proud. But the thing is, you never achieve something that which you do not see yourself to achieve. That's why I wanted to start there. See yourself as the guy who already has production experience. See yourself as the guy or the person who has already accomplished this. And this is inner work, and this is something that you need to do on a regular basis. That's the first one. Let's move on to the second one. The second one is, now that you have promoted yourself, now that you have given yourself a new title, the next thing, the next natural thing will be for you to start doing the work. And the second thing that you need to do to succeed as a SQL Server DBA, even without production experience, is to learn how the technology works, right? Learn how the technology works. And it's not enough for you to learn it, you have got to master it. You know, the internet has given us so much information where people would say information is power, knowledge is power. And I stopped believing that ever since the internet has given us massive amounts of information. I mean, people are drowning in information nowadays. And so when you start to see people learning a specific thing, oh, I'll go on YouTube, watch a YouTube video, or I will watch an online course about this. It is easy to believe that you know how the technology works, but until you do it until you practice it. Then you really don't know the technology. Um, it's interesting because, again, most people would think, but I don't have production experience. How do I learn the technology, or how do I master the technology? That's why I started off with the first thing, where you have to promote yourself, give yourself a new title, because a lot of people would, again, I did mention, a lot of people would think, we were never given the opportunity to work with this technology. We did not get the opportunity to even touch the failover cluster or the availability group. They just gave it to us and said, you go work with it. And most people wait for the opportunity before they learn the technology, but it should be the other way around. You have to learn the technology before the opportunity gets there. And like I said earlier, with all of the information available out on the internet, it can be confusing. I mean, here's a quick exercise. Read all the Microsoft documentation and tell me what you get out of that. Quick exercise. Read the Microsoft documentation about failover clustering, about always on availability groups. You'll get so confused. And that's why, even with so much information out on the internet, it is very challenging to learn the technology. And a side effect of that is it will take you longer to even understand how the technology works. The thing about this is, it's not enough for you to learn it with the available information. It is important for you to learn the technology with the right structure, the right system, and the right training. I did mention earlier, just go read all of the Microsoft documentation and then come back and tell me what that tells you. The Microsoft documentation is not written with mere mortals like me in mind. Meaning, it's not written for the ordinary person who does not have a technical background. And that's why it is important for you to understand that there is a structure. I've seen people who have started working with availability groups and started learning always on availability groups, but not necessarily understand the underlying platform that is Windows Server failover clustering. And so, because of that, what they read from a blog post, what they read from a Microsoft documentation would confuse them all the more. And then they go and look at another resource, and it also gets even more confusing, because there's so many information out there that are now, I don't want to say contradictory, but it becomes overwhelming to a point where, like, I'm not going to do this. It's just so much work. Plus, I work 12-hour, 14-hour days, and I don't have enough time to do this. And so people will just wait until the opportunity comes before they start learning it. This is non-negotiable. If you want to succeed at SQL Server DBA, without production experience, you have to learn how the technology works. And not just learn, but to master. The key here is repetition. Do the same thing over and over and over again. Repeat the process until you are confident enough to not just implement it, but design, to maintain, to manage, and even troubleshoot it in the future. The key is not just learning, but also mastery. But in order for you to properly learn, you got to find the right structure. Building an always-on available groups has a process. You have to find the right structure. You can't just build in a SQL Server always-on available groups and, wait, Microsoft allowed SQL Server 2017 to run without a failover cluster. Go ahead, let's build it, and then not realizing, oh, we need high availability. We have to build a failover cluster. There is a sequence on how to build an always-on available groups. Same thing with troubleshooting. If you don't have a system and a structure in place, it can get overwhelming. Now, I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier, but what about production experience? I don't have production. How do I get this? It's interesting because when you start to think about how a technology evolved, nobody in the beginning had production experience. What do I mean by that? In SQL, back in 2012, when SQL Server 2012 was released, nobody can claim that they have production experience other than the people who either are TAP customers or the technology adoption program customers who would deploy SQL Server always on available groups even before it is officially RTM, right? So nobody could claim that they have production experience. So how come 2 years later or 1 year later, immediately after SQL Server was released or SQL Server 2012 was released, how come experts like myself and people in the Microsoft community, how come they were able to deploy an always-on available? They don't have production experience. The product was recently released, and so how were they able to do that? And that's because they learned the technology inside and out. They mastered the technology. They repeated the process of designing, building, and managing an always-on available groups even before it was released to the general public. And so they were qualified enough to build these. Production experience, if you start to really think about this, they're using the same software. You know, if you're learning SQL Server and you haven't worked with always on available groups yet, the companies, the Fortune 500 companies, are using the same version and edition of SQL Server that is readily available to you. And so when you start to think about this, and this is where I start introducing, you got to have your own lab environment. I call it the tech experts digital sandbox. You got to have a place, an infrastructure, a lab environment where you can learn and try. Like I said earlier, it's not enough for you to learn. You got to try it. You got to apply what you've learned. And this is where a lab environment becomes very, very important. Now, back in the days, and I talk about back in the days, I sound like somebody who's really old. 20 years ago, this is kind of challenging without virtualization, without cheap hardware, even without the cloud. It was challenging. However, Microsoft gives you the opportunity to download evaluation copies of Windows, evaluation copies of SQL Server, and it is the same version and same edition of SQL Server that Fortune 500 companies are using or these enterprise customers are using. There is no excuse today to not have your own personal lab. And you know how it is when people would say, I don't have the money to buy a laptop that is powerful enough. You don't need a powerful laptop. You just need something that works. Because you're not testing for performance. You are testing for functionality so you can learn the technology. I remember my very first official job as production DBA. I come from the developer background, name it, Complus, Visual Basic. So I come from that background, and I just had the guts to apply for the official title is a data center engineer. And back then, we were the cloud. The official title was a data center engineer, but when I looked at the job description, it literally is a SQL Server DBA job, except, of course, the person responsible for that role will have other responsibilities outside of SQL Server, like managing IIS and managing the operating system, which is, of course, not something that a typical SQL Server DBA does. And so I had the guts to apply for that job. And I remember the question that the interviewer, who ended up becoming the engineering manager, had one question that he asked. And he asked, do you have production experience with managing SQL Server? I don't want to lie, I did not have, back then, I did not have production experience working with SQL Server. And coming from a developer background, you kind of wonder, how would I even land a job if I can't even answer his question, whether or not, and I don't want to lie like that. However, I followed up my response by saying, I may not have production experience with SQL Server the way you expect it to. However, I know SQL Server inside and out. Of course, back then, SQL Server 7, SQL Server 2000, it's easy to know SQL Server inside and out because all you focus on is the relational database engine. I told the interviewer, I know SQL Server better than any of your engineers. And mind you, the engineers working for this company, they're top notch. They used to work for big tech companies. But I know SQL Server inside and out, the relational database engine, that is, back then. And I can do what your engineers cannot do. And I wasn't lying because I had been learning SQL Server as early as SQL Server 7. I remember building my own, not mine, but somebody else's. I had the opportunity to work with somebody who has a computer training business. So I would put together computers, and these are desktop computers, not servers. I would install Windows NT4, I would install SQL Server, I would build an Active Directory domain, and I would try out everything. I had production experience not because I worked in a production environment. I had production experience because I know the technology inside and out. I've simulated a ton of possibilities, and I was a regular at the back then it was a Microsoft TechNet and MSDN forums. So I was looking at questions, answering questions, and if I don't know how to answer the question, I would simulate that. I would emulate building that environment and testing. So I had the confidence to tell the interviewer, I can do the job better than any of your engineers. Of course, I'm pretty sure about that because they wouldn't be hiring for a SQL Server DBA if they had somebody who had the background. And I got the job. And that is proof that you don't really need production experience, but rather you need to learn how the technology works, master, and the key to this is repetition, and have the lab environment to practice and test. And like I said, in today's world, there is no excuse not to have one. You don't need a very expensive hardware. Your laptop is more than enough. In fact, it took me what? I've worked in IT for more than 10 years before I even got my own personal computer, my own. It's mostly being given to me, loaned to me, but it took me 10 years before I even got my own. So that's the second one. And I spent some time talking about this because people a lot of DBAs are thinking, I cannot get that job because I don't have the experience. Well, you create your own experience, your own production experience by simulating it, by emulating it, right? And the third thing, okay, so first you have to promote yourself, give yourself a new title. The second thing is you need to learn the technology, learn how it works, and then master it. It is challenging though to learn and master it if you're looking at information from all over. You need to have the right structure in place. You need to have the right sequence and the right training to do that. Of course, part of it is building your own lab and testing everything that you've learned. Otherwise, it's just head knowledge. It's just theory. Big difference between theory and application. Third is to find a mentor. And it took me years before I finally understood what this means. Because in tech, we have been conditioned, you go figure things out on your own, right? Learn this thing on your own. The problem with that is we don't have the luxury of time. When you're younger, you have 24 hours in the day, do whatever you want with it. If you're younger, you have like 5-10 years to learn all of this. But if you have been struggling with learning something as complicated as an always-on available, this could take years. And I've worked with people, they've been working as senior SQL Server DBAs for years. Some of them have like 10, 15 years experience. But because they've never had the opportunity to work with failover clusters, with availability groups, it was challenging for them to even learn the concept. Not to mention, of course, some of the information out there are outdated. And so they were learning, like I said, they were reading Microsoft documentation, and they could not even build their own lab, mainly because one phrase in a Microsoft documentation would throw them off. Like, I can't do this because, right? Having a mentor, having a guide that helps you every step of the way makes the learning a lot faster. Sure, it is challenging. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's simple. The more simple something is, the faster you learn it. And when, again, my biggest advantage working with availability groups in the earlier days was I had access to the product team. I had access to the Microsoft support people. I've had access to the Microsoft Certified Masters, the Microsoft MVPs, and that is a huge thing, right? Having guidance makes learning faster. So instead of you trying to work things out on your own, trying to learn, again, just try it out. And it took me when I was learning failover clustering, because I needed to learn failover clustering. It took me, I think, 5 years until I realized I can't really do this on my own. So I started reaching out to people from Microsoft who have been working with failover clustering for years. And that accelerated the learning process. So having the right mentor, I mean, I used to, somebody once mentioned, an analogy, like, for instance, baking a cake. I don't know how to bake a cake, but let's just imagine that I do. The learning process would not be easy if, number one, you don't know the recipe. And even if you do know the recipe, if you're not following the process of how to bake a cake, it would screw up the cake. I don't know why I'm using the cake analogy, but the thing is, wouldn't it be better if you have an expert chef working with you as you're trying to learn all of these things? Again, the challenge with most technical professionals is they're trying to learn things on their own, thinking, oh, I need to do this on my own. And one of the reasons why I emphasize asking for help is because I have tons and tons of experiences where I tried to do this on my own, took me quite a while, and I asked for help, and it was quick and fast. I solved the problem. Same thing with learning. If you have the right guide to walk you every step of the way, instead of you trying to figure out, is this the right Microsoft documentation that I'd be referring to? Is this the right thing that I need to be doing? Oh, if I'm troubleshooting an outage, what would I be doing? Should I be reading the Microsoft cluster error log first? Instead of guessing what you need to do and having somebody walk you through the entire process, that'll be a lot faster. That would save you years and turning years into weeks instead. And these would help you succeed as a SQL Server DBA, even without production experience. Again, just summarizing the three things. First is promote yourself. Give yourself a new title. Of course, don't go around and telling people, "Hey, I'm the new CTO." Tell yourself that. Give yourself a new title. That's the first one. The second one is to learn how the tech works. Learn how SQL Server always on availability groups work. Learn how failover clustering works. Learn how the operating system works. And then master the technology. The only way to master the technology is by doing the work, meaning apply what you learned. Trial and error. Of course, wouldn't it be great if you're just trying to reinforce the learning and then the error comes in the latter part? That way you don't get frustrated trying to learn these things. I'm sharing from experience. Learn the tech, master the tech, get your hands dirty. That's the second one. And third, find a mentor, find a guide to help you in every step of the way to learn this quickly so that you can be confident enough to tackle on a challenge, work on a task, even if you've never done it before. And for years, I struggled with this. I struggled with the fact that, hey, isn't, because most people would say fake it till you make it, right? It took me years to finally embrace this until I heard Sir Richard Branson on one of his interviews. He said, if you don't know how to do something today and you were given the responsibility to do it, just take the responsibility. Just take on the challenge and then learn it along the way. And I'm like, wait a second, wouldn't that give me a little bit of a doubt? Wouldn't that screw up my performance because I don't trust and that's why I started off with the first one. Give yourself a new title, promote yourself, assume that you already know how to do it. And that's why I said that's the most challenging piece. Start with telling yourself it's already done. And then it's easy for you, it will be easy for you to start doing the work. Learn it along the way. That's why when a new challenge comes in, I would evaluate it. Some people would say, no, that's kind of like lying and telling people that you know this. Deep within, you already know you've accomplished something. This is just technology. It's just one piece of the puzzle. There's other things alongside with technology that would help you succeed. I mean, I couldn't count the number of times when I get brought in as a SQL Server expert working with always on available groups, realizing that, you know, the operational process was the one that's a little bit screwed up. And that's one piece of the entire solution. So technology is just one of the many things. But you need these three things: promoting yourself or giving yourself a new title, learning how the tech works, becoming a master through repetition, and three, finding a mentor who can guide you every step of the way so that it won't take you forever to try and learn this. Because the key here is really building your confidence. And this is what I do in my SQL Server Always On Available Groups, Senior DBAs, Ultimate Field Guide training class. I could not count how many people would come in. They don't have experience. They were given the responsibility to build. In fact, somebody I worked with last year, he's not worked with SQL Server before. He was an Oracle DBA, not worked with SQL Server, well, a little bit of SQL Server, but has not worked with always on available groups. And he was given the responsibility as the lead engineer to build this massively complex architecture. And he was freaking out in the beginning. The key here is really following these three things. At the end of, we worked for like 8 weeks. At the end of it, he went from, I don't know anything about this, to becoming the lead engineer, taking care of the whole deployment. He now is responsible for making sure that their always on available group solution is rock solid, it's stable and highly reliable. It's a huge deployment for them. Like I said, this is what I teach people in my SQL Server Always On Available Groups, the Senior DBA's Ultimate Field Guide training program. If you need help of a mentor or a guide that would help you accelerate the learning experience so you can succeed as a SQL Server DBA with this skill, use the link on the screen, schedule a strategy session where we can talk about what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? We'll start with that. You want to be very, very clear about what it is that you want to accomplish. And then we'll look at what's working, what's not working. And if I can help you get to where you want to go, I'll be more than happy to help you with that. If not, I will steer you in the direction that would help you achieve those goals. And the one thing, like I said, learning the technology is very confusing with all the Microsoft documentation. Just having the step-by-step strategy on how to accomplish your goal is in itself valuable. So use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that conversation. I'm more than happy to help you with any challenges that you may have, all right? That is about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Tune in again next week where I talk about another topic. And the thing about these topics is I sometimes working with a client, I see the challenges that they're experiencing, and then another client has the same. And so I kind of see patterns, and these are challenges that people are experiencing, specifically, like I said, when they already have an always-on availability solution, but nobody on their teams are capable of taking on the responsibility. And that's how I came up with these strategies, right? So enjoy the rest of your weekend. I say weekend because it's Friday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again next week. Bye.